the top line, the black line, that represents the household sector. Now notice that household sector debt increased from something like $4 trillion in 1993 to $14 trillion in 2008, from 4 to 14. And then they started defaulting. What we want to know is this line going to go higher again, or is it going to keep going lower? This is by far the most important sector of the US economy. Well, I'm afraid it's going to go lower for two big reasons. First of all, the home is the most important source of collateral for the Americans, and home prices have dropped on average by 34%. So there's 34% less collateral for the Americans to borrow against. Therefore, they will borrow less. Therefore, this will keep contracting. But the second reason is median income is dropping in the United States. Median income is now, on an inflation-adjusted basis, back to more or less where it was in 1989. It's dropping not only because of this severe recession, but also because of globalization. Globalization is putting extreme downward pressure on US wages as all the manufacturing jobs are sent overseas where workers make $5 a day. So that's likely to continue. Therefore, this black line is likely to keep dropping. Now the red line, that represents the government sector's debt. The government has had $5 trillion of budget deficits over the last 4 years. It's been that increase in government debt that's kept total debt from contracting. Had total debt started to contract, we would have spiraled into a depression already. Can government debt go higher? Well, I think it can. Now US government debt is only 100% of US GDP. On Japan's government debt is 240% of GDP. That tells you the US could take its debt higher at the government level. And also, look at the government bond yields. The government only has to pay 1.7% to borrow 10-year money. That tells you the government can borrow a lot more. So the problem here is not financial or economic, it's political. The entire political debate in America now is about how government is evil, how government can do no good, how government spending must be reduced as quickly as possible, and how the government budget deficits must be eliminated. So we have a very serious political problem. Now the next line, the last one I'll talk about here, is the corporate sector. Well, corporate sector, they could probably increase their debt, but they have so much cash on their books already, they don't need to increase their debt anymore. And also their capacity utilization is very low, so they don't need to borrow and invest more either. So they're not likely to increase their debt. Now, this shows the financial sector. And this is really the last really important line is this one. This line represents Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Fannie and Freddie took their debt from $1 trillion 20 years ago to $8 trillion in 2008. And as they sold an extra $7 trillion of bonds, they received $7 trillion in cash, which they used to buy $7 trillion of mortgages. And as they bought $7 trillion of mortgages, they pushed up the property prices, and that allowed more equity extraction, and that allowed the Americans to consume more and import more, and that allowed the rest of the world to export much more. That fueled globalization. And then in 2008, Fannie and Freddie went bankrupt and had to be taken over by the government. Their debt's likely to contract rather than to expand. The red line represents the rise and fall of those groups responsible for the subprime disaster. The private sector issuers of asset-backed securities like Countrywide and IndyMac. Well, most of them are out of business now, and that's likely to keep dropping. So that's it. Those are all the major sectors of the US economy. And what we've seen is that the private sector debt is much more likely to keep contracting. Only the government debt really has the possibility of expanding, but for political reasons it may not be able to. So where does that leave us? Now, you've seen this chart before, but now I'm projecting it into the future. This is total credit market debt adjusted for inflation. But now I'm projecting it out into the future to 2015. To do this, I have to make two assumptions. The first assumption, because it's adjusted for inflation, I have to assume what the inflation rate is going to be. Well, here I'm assuming only 1%. Now, that's not completely impossible, but that's really very optimistic. If it's 3%, you can take another 2% off these bars, and it looks much worse. The second assumption I'm making is about the change in the private sector debt. I've told you I think the private sector debt is going to keep contracting, but here I'm assuming that it remains flat. In other words, no change in private sector debt, no increase, no decrease. So then what this really incorporates is only one thing, and that's the change in the government debt. Now we know the government debt is going to keep increasing because the government's going to continue to have a big budget deficit every year. The Congressional Budget Office projects what these deficits will be, so I've simply taken the CBO numbers and plugged them into my spreadsheet, and this is what we get. We get a situation where there's no credit growth for as far as the eye can see. And that, I'm afraid, is painting a very, very dire outlook for the US economy and the global economy. Nothing like this has occurred since the Great Depression. Every time we've had just a couple of years of no credit growth, we had a very severe recession. And now we're looking at a situation where it appears that credit in the US can't grow for as far as the eye can see under very optimistic assumptions. Now, the Austrian economists were very good at understanding the role that credit plays in creating economic booms. As long as credit expands rapidly, it creates economic growth and prosperity. But they understood that the day always arrives when credit can't expand anymore. And when that happens, in their terminology, the depression begins. And for them, the depression is in a sense, a healing process that takes the economy back to some sort of pre-credit equilibrium where it would have been had there not been an explosion of credit to start with. And the great American economist Irving Fisher described how the debt deflation spiral works in a very famous article, The Debt Deflation Theory of Great Depressions. So in other words, we've had a 4.5-decade, $50 trillion expansion of credit that's been driving the global economy, and now it looks like credit can't expand anymore. And it's only been the increase in government debt, $5 trillion in 4 years, that's prevented this new depression from occurring. The New Depression, which, by the way, is the name of my new book. Now, let me explain now how this has impacted the global economy. This chart shows the US trade deficit, the current account deficit, more or less the same thing. Now notice that historically, this goes back to 1960. The important thing to understand is that historically, trade between countries balanced. Trade between countries had to balance. But starting in the 1980s, the US trade deficit blew out to 3.5% of GDP, and by 2006, it was 6% of GDP. In 2006, the US trade deficit was $800 billion. That was the equivalent of $2 million a minute that the US was going into debt to the rest of the world and paying for that debt with paper money or government bonds denominated in paper money. This has been the driver of global economic growth. And now with the US in crisis, this isn't going to continue driving the global economy. This is going to flatten out at best or even contract further. It's very important to understand that nothing like this has ever occurred in history before. They say that there's nothing new under the sun, but indeed there is. There has never been a large country with a trade deficit like this in human history. It's very important to understand how trade between countries used to work when we were on a gold standard, which was up until 1971 when the Bretton Woods system broke down. Once you understand how trade between countries worked under a gold standard, then it becomes clear what's gone so badly wrong now that we no longer are on a gold standard. So let me explain. Let me give you an example. Bear with me for a moment. 150 years ago, if England had a very large trade deficit with France, then England's gold would literally have been put on a ship and sent over to France. Gold was money, so England's money supply would have contracted, and England would have therefore have gone into a very severe recession. Unemployment would have gone up, and they would have had deflation. And the opposite would have happened in France. France would have had more gold, so their economy would have expanded and boomed, and employment would have increased, and soon they would have had inflation. So pretty soon, the rich French would start buying more cheap English goods, and the poor, unemployed English would stop buying so many expensive French goods, and trade would balance again. So in other words, there was an automatic adjustment mechanism within the gold standard that ensured that trade between countries balanced. That's how trade worked up until 1971. So when David Ricardo and Adam Smith wrote all of classical economic theory, their world was a world in which gold was money and trade balanced. Well, things don't work like that anymore. In 1968, we broke the link between dollars and gold. In 1971, the Bretton Woods system broke down completely, and things started changing. Suddenly, the United States discovered that it didn't have to pay for goods from other countries with gold. It could pay for them with paper dollars. And so it started running a very big trade deficit. initially with Japan.